Tudo bem, and welcome to another installment of Portuguese Online. I am your host, Joe Lyon, and today we are going to be talking about verbs. Verbs are pretty awesome things, especially in the Portuguese language. They're basically the thing running the show. The more videos you watch, the more you learn about the Portuguese words, the more you realize how truly dynamic these words are. So we're going to start things a little bit easier by just going through the basics of verbs, and that is verb conjugation. That sounds like a very long word. Let me explain a little bit. Verb conjugation is basically the change of a verb depending on what pronoun it is supporting, if that makes any sense. Verb conjugation is an art form. It is wonderful, it is beautiful, and it is something that the English language has very little of. However, there is a little hint of it that does exist. Now, an example of this in English is he speak. Right, that's correct. That's the way that I hear it. You go to America and England and people say that naturally. Right? No, I'm just kidding. You actually need to add the S at the end for he speaks. Because of the pronoun, the verb is changed. And if you change the pronoun, for instance, into I, now we're going into the singular first person, no longer does I speaks make any sense. You have to change the conjugation of the verb. You have to change the verb to match its pronoun. So now instead of I speaks, it is simply I speak. So what do we have when we have a verb that is not changed, or otherwise not conjugated? I mean, what do we have when it's in its purest form? And that is simply what is called, very unoriginally, a non-conjugated verb. Now, a non-conjugated verb in English would be to speak. We have this special to in the front, and the reason why, it doesn't matter right now, just go with it. If we want to conjugate this and take it out of its pure form, then we just simply add the pronoun and then change the conjugation. And that's really how you conjugate a verb in English. Now, Portuguese has unconjugated verbs as well, verbs in its pure form. And to speak in its unconjugated form is falar. In Portuguese, when the change happens, it actually happens with these two last letters. So instead of taking the to out, like we do in English, we take the AR out in Portuguese. And once we take that out, what we put in its place really depends on what the pronoun is. So here we have our trusty grid that we used in the pronoun videos. Now this grid we're going to be using a lot in a lot of different videos for many different occasions. So we're actually going to use its name, which is the tense grid. It is the grid that shows the tenses of different verbs. But because I am very informal, I'm going to call it the awesome grid. I'm going to zoom up a little bit as well. Okay, I hope you can see that better. Now, like I said before, if we have a verb in an unconjugated form, we have falar, which means to speak. Now let's continue putting that in all these small boxes. So this is the word to speak in Portuguese, falar. It is in its unconjugated form, its pure form. It has not yet been changed by the pronoun, but once we add the pronoun, and you can remember the pronouns from the previous video, then you have to take away things and then add to it. And like what was stated before, we take away the last two letters, which is the AR. So now with the AR taken away from each of these unconjugated verbs, we can now put the pronoun in. And you can remember that the singular first was eu, and then você, there was Ellie and Ella, there was nós, there was vocês, and finally Ellies and Ellas. Now when we have eu, the ending that we put on after fal is an o. This makes it eu falo. This is the correct grammatical way of saying I speak in Portuguese. Eu falo. If you were to say eu falar, that would be horrifying to the ears of the Portuguese speaker. Next down the list with você, you have an A at the end, and that is você fala. You do the exact same thing with a third person, where you have ele fala and ela fala. With nós, this one's the fun one, this is actually my favorite, you have amus. Like, hey, look at that big moose over there, it's a moose. So you have nós falamos. This one's kind of an interesting one too, because it says am, so it looks like vocês falam, but actually we don't pronounce the M, and it actually becomes kind of the same as an O, except when it is an O, as an AO with that little crazy thing on top, That's what gets the stress, as mentioned in the syllables video. However, when it is an AM, it is not in the loose ear, and it is not a diphthong. And so therefore it doesn't get the stress. So it is the exact same thing as this one, except the stress is on the second to last syllable. So instead of saying falon or falon, you have falon. And it's the exact same thing with the third of the plural. You have Elis falon and Elas falon. Now, if your verb ends with AR, it doesn't really matter what verb you use. Now, there are a couple of exceptions, and we'll go over those later, but for the majority of them, you use this exact same system. So, for instance, you learned to speak, as in falar. You also learned things such as to use, which is usar. You basically do the exact same thing. You put in usar, you take away the AR at the end, you add whatever the pronoun is for the circumstance, in this case it's eu, and then you add the grammatically correct ending, which in this case, because it's eu, you have an o, so it's eu usu. Now that seemed a little bit complicated, but there is an easier way of doing this, and that's just by saying what the ending is. And so instead of saying falon, we just don't worry about what the verb is, the original verb, and we just say oh. And so that's what we're basically going to be doing every time that we talk about verbs and verb conjugation endings in the future. Now we can move this back a little bit. Now let's have a little bit of a review, because all that seemed a little bit complicated. With the exception of a couple of verbs that we'll talk about later, every single verb that ends with AR has this pattern for the ending of its verb conjugation. And to make it even easier, we can even eliminate this line right here, which makes it pretty cool because you only have 4 endings to remember. So if you have eu as an I, the ending would be an O, no matter what the verb is in the AR form. If it is in the second or third person of the singular form, it ends with an A. For example, ela fala, eli fala, você fala. For nos, it ends in amos. You can think of it as, hey, what's that big animal with the large antlers? Well, that's a moose. Except you have to kind of say it weird, as in amos. That is kind of weird. And if the pronoun is vocês, eles, or elas, the verb conjugation ending is Keep in mind that it is not stressed. Now hopefully I've simplified it as much as possible. It still might be a little bit weird at first, however, once you get used to it, and once you actually start looking at Portuguese phrases, you will start seeing these everywhere you go. Every single sentence has something a lot like this. Now what's the best way to practice these is actually to write them out over and over and over again, also to say them over and over and over and over again. Have someone quiz you if you know a native speaker, have them test you out. A couple videos ago we actually gave you a lot of verbs in their pure unconjugated form, such as andar and falar. Now you can use these unconjugated verbs that we gave you, I think there was about 8 on that list, and try that little equation thing that we did. Put the unconjugated verb, take away the ending, add the pronoun, then add the ending that goes with that pronoun. Now doing that over and over and over and over and over again, it will become a habit and you won't even need to think about it every time that you conjugate a verb. Now before we go, we're going to talk about the next video. We're actually going to do pretty much the same thing except with verbs that don't end with AR but end with ER. And there's a couple verbs actually that we want you to memorize before you watch that video. Now there are 7 vocab words in all. The first one is conhecer, which is to know someone, which is different than knowing a fact. Escrever, which is to write. Ler, which is to read. Comer, which is to eat, like to eat a pie. Esquecer, which is to forget. I use that one all the time when learning the language. Viver, which means to live, however, not to live in a house, but to live a life. And morrer, which is to die. A little bit morbid, but it works. You want me to add another one? I can add another one. Aprender, which is to learn. Well, I hope you enjoyed that video. We hope to see you next time, and keep memorizing, and good luck with that. My name is Joe Lyon, and I'll see you next time. Ciao.